Hi everyone, it's nice to see you. And I don't know how you feel this point of the semester, but yeah, I just saw Liz shaking their head like this. I think we all feel like that, and so for that reason, honestly, I'm delighted, and other reasons too, but especially for assuaging us as to these feelings and redressing them. I'm delighted to have Angela Naimou here, because Angela Naimou is somebody who not only studies how you can reclaim meaning, how one can reclaim meaning out of the ruins, but actually does it with a verve and spirit and generosity that is a great cure for the late winter blahs. Angela Naimou is Associate Professor of English at Clemson University, where her research and teaching interests include contemporary literature and culture of the US, Caribbean, and the Middle East, theories of race, ethnicity, migration, and diaspora, and the intersections of law, economy, and personhood, which really forms, all these things form the nexus of the book I will mention in a moment. She gives of herself generously and brilliantly. She's associate editor for the journal College Literature, and she serves on the editorial board of Humanities Journal from Penn. And she's also the treasurer of the Association for the Study of the Arts of the Present, which is the context under which we met, although she was the co-organizer of the conference. And so, again, her ability to gather, to bring people together in ways that are intellectually sustaining is something I had a chance to witness more or less firsthand. I'm deeply impressed. Her book, Salvage Work, U.S. and Caribbean Literature Amid the Debris of Legal Personhood, which I'll pass around. It's a marvelous book that talks about the idea of the debris of legal personhood, of the legacies of slavery and indenture and human disposability, and how art seeks to respond to that, not always to rehabilitate, but to salvage. What can be salvaged? How can it be salvaged? This book was awarded the ASAP Book Prize in 2016 for the best scholarly book in the arts of the present, and received an honorable mention in the MLA William Sanders Scarborough Prize for outstanding scholarly study of African American literature and culture. And her talk today, as you can see from behind me, is Missing, which I will reclaim from the debris of
the
technological personhood. Yes, not personhood. Who is the laptop user? Reiko will salvage that. So anyway, please join me in giving a big Penn State welcome to Angela Naimou.
Thank you all. I think this visit is going to cure me of my own mid-semester slug and blah. So thank you so much for this gathering and for inviting me to be part of this series. And thanks to Reiko, to Jonathan, Devin, Aurélie, who helped me brace the cold. I came without my coat, but it's all fixed now. And it's really wonderful to be here. Okay, so the talk today is part of a new book project I'm calling Refugee Futurity, Global Forms of Refuge and Refusal. The title is done, and almost nothing else yet, but and that's why I'm very excited to get to the question and answer and get your ideas. So in this project, I'm trying to consider the literary and political forms that shape refugee experiences and representations of time and space. So like how does time and space get conceptualized, experienced, and also activated in literary forms, and work at those different levels. So in a basic way, the idea of refugee futures take conceptual material and literary form. Its conceptual forms can be outlined through legal and political thought and philosophies of time and space and place. Its material forms can be seen in the layout of a refugee camp, the architecture of detention centers, the ship's hold, the truck's trailer, or the historical treatise of a border checkpoint. And literary forms can replot and unlock existing temporal and spatial patterns around the concept of movement and the concepts of precarity, refuge, and return. And I'm especially excited for your ideas on how to go forward with this. So the talk is titled Mediterranean Returns, Elegy and Forced Migration. The Mediterranean is only one of 18 major refugee situations spotlighted by the UNHCR and involves a small fraction of the more than 65 million people living in displaced refugee or refugee-like situations globally. That's the UNHCR's term, refugee-like situations. But as the only situation that borders multiple EU states and the North African and Middle Eastern states that they're so heavily involved with, the sea is a highly visible site for the conflict between the freedom to move from war or insecurity and the sanctions against it by political actors who promote or mitigate the very conditions that prompt people to move through irregular channels in the first place. The Mediterranean thus highlights the many ways persons on the move are transformed into legal identities that state and humanitarian actors proceed to manage. The migrant to detain, imprison, or put in camps. The infiltrator, to use Israel's legal term for irregular border crossers, to punish. The victim of trafficking or smuggling to rescue, forcibly repatriate, or remove to a third country. The refugee to grant asylum to, or the dead to inspect or to let go. These are the futures designed for the crossers to find. The Mediterranean also has become the vital coordinates for theories of blackness that take the afterlife of slavery as a grounding condition, where blackness is always being in the wake. So what Christina Sharp theorizes as a position, quote, in the modalities of black life, lived in, as, under, despite black death, to think and be and act from there. And that thinking and being and acting is what she calls wake work, something she beautifully outlines in the generative possibilities of such work. Black studies scholars P. Khalil Sassier and Shreyan P. Woods put the situation more bluntly. They write, today's scene in the Mediterranean reveals slavery's afterlife. Black suffering and death in the Mediterranean sustains and resuscitates European democratic society. In this view, non-racial humanitarian critiques of the crisis are both figure and ground of anti-blackness. What Europe's border regimes enabled, the Libyan torture camps and slave auctions, or the Israeli expulsions of Eritrean and Sudanese nationals through so-called voluntary departure policies, are just the more spectacular instances of a deep racial migration order. Here in the Mediterranean, a storied space of intercultural connectivity and creativity, hailed as the open, the cosmic, the infinite, and the place where refugees and local citizens are playing out a stunningly incoherent and punitive border politics on small spots of land, becomes just another name for anti-blackness. War and post-colonial politics in the global south and the migration responses of the global north reveal a deep, originary current of anti-blackness, which Sharp calls simply the weather. But I want to suggest that something worthwhile may be lost if we don't take seriously how that anti-blackness operates and cooperates with other currents, with specific political and legal forms and operations to bring us to this moment. Anti-blackness may be seen as everywhere as the weather, or as originary as the root, but I want to resist its singularity as critique that collapses into itself related forces and contingencies, unsolved questions worth asking, possible futures worth calling for. Straining to contend with these two responses to the Mediterranean refugee situation, one focused on humanitarian critiques of border management and the other on conceptualizing psychic structures of anti-blackness, is the contemporary poetry of Mourning by Warsan Shire and Aracelis Girmay. Shire, Nairobi-born, London-based with family ties in Somalia, and Girmay, Santa Ana, California-born, with routes from what she calls Eritrea, Puerto Rico, and African America, figure the Mediterranean Sea as a site of returns. Returns failed, incomplete, forced, or impossible. The concept of returns organizes a poetics of the Mediterranean. It also structures the politics that organize refugee crossings of what's been called the world's deadliest border. As a return to grief, the Elegy for refugee loss also becomes a revisiting of basic questions about the shape and time of mourning, the source of violence, justice, ethics, the past and future of migration, and the work of Elegy to mourn at once too late and in advance. In what follows, I suggest that the concept of return can help us think about how poetry responds to the politics of refuge in the Mediterranean and to the capacity for poetry to generate and perform a space and time of grief. Return is a concept, of course, already burdened in many ways. It's burdened by the promise to end indefinite exile and dispossession, as in the Palestinian demand for the right of return, or the haq al-awda. Burdened by the non-literal return given the force of law, as in the Israeli right of law of return. And burdened by the names we give to deportation, as in repatriation or return to the patria, as in state or UN-managed voluntary returns or voluntary departures, named voluntary despite or because they're often unwanted. They're unwanted returns that people agree to, usually from pressure and hospitality and despair. And for philosopher Babar Kassan, the concept of return is a fantasy of origins and a lesson that language is the true home we inhabit. And the term nostalgia, with nostos as return and algos, pain or suffering, she finds the mythos of return, Greek roots for a term invented by the Swiss to name a sickness and exemplified by Odysseus's endlessly desired and perpetually deferred return. And she does this while she lives in Corsica. I want to think about the forms that refugee futurity take when we think about the sea and the many returns it enables, the sending or bringing, the coming or going back of those who traverse it, but also the returns it brings to states and organizations in the senses of political gain and economic profit, and the conceptual returns it brings to poetry and theory on the recurrence of forced migration itself and the mourning that it so often gives way to. So this next section is Home. Two poems by Shiré titled Home and Conversations About Home at the Deportation Center are not explicitly elegies. Moving between humanitarian appeals and bleak assessments of state power, Home was written and circulated widely in the fall of 2015 as an intervention in the public debates over whether refugees deserve to be welcomed by Europe. So it opens with a sense of urgency anyone, including you, would feel in conditions of terror. I'm going to be reading a lot of the poems. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. You might have heard this poem or seen it on YouTube. It was read aloud in public places by Benedict Cumberbatch and other famous people, made into YouTube videos and went viral through social media. And it was clearly this call to renew public feeling and change policy. Its poetics of intervention are underscored when we read Home as a rewrite of Shiré's earlier poem, Conversations About Home at the Deportation Center. Written in 2009 and published in her 2011 book, Teaching My Mother How to Give Birth. Shiré wrote Conversations after visiting with a group of young undocumented refugees from Somalia, Eritrea, Congo, and Sudan, living in the abandoned Somali embassy in Rome, a city whose outskirts house what's called the Identification and Expulsion Center, a massive detention complex. The title locates the poem at the deportation center. The news accounts of its composition locates the poet at the abandoned embassy. Inhabiting both place names are the unauthorized forms of black life that dread future deportation, abandoned by diplomatic channels to legality. Conversations doesn't have the relentless momentum of short and jam lines. It's a prose poem of first-person voices answering the question of how they fell into a time out of place. This is from that poem. They asked me, how did you get here? Can't you see it on my body? The Libyan desert red with immigrant bodies, the Gulf of Aden bloated, the city of Rome with no jacket. I hope the journey meant more than miles because all of my children are in the water. I thought the sea was safer than the land. If there's explanation here, it's presumed to be useless. This is titled A Conversation, not an asylum interview. This is a deportation center, not a welcome one. The 2015 poem's line, no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land, is in the conditional present tense to undo the finality it carries for a thinking speaker subject in the original poem. I thought the sea was safer than the land. Home is designed to intervene before it's too late again, but it's salvaged from a poetry of witness that sees itself as already too late. It gives voice, Conversations gives voice to those who thought they had escaped, only to face imminent return to the mouth of that shark. Where the 2015 poem becomes an opportunity to recalibrate the time of deportability into a time of hospitality, the 2011 poem ends by quietly reminding us that time will yield a different kind of return, the inevitable meeting again of listener and speaker in an afterlife, beyond the realm of land and water and legal channels. And this is from the poem. It ends this way. All I can say is I was once like you, the apathy, the pity, the ungrateful placement, and now my home is the mouth of a shark. Now my home is the barrel of a gun. I'll see you on the other side. As a poem posted online to be timely, the 2015 Home highlights the basic fact of writing as belated. Shiré rearranges the humanitarian failures in the 2011 poem into this kind of second chance for Europe in the 2015 poem. But what led Shiré to write Home and propelled its wide circulation also haunts its temporality, a present tense escape and temporary refuge. The summer that, up until that year, had been the highest death toll in the Mediterranean Sea, to be surpassed the next year. And this next part is Elegy. A poem voicing its urgency to intervene does so in response to the fact that its arrival is in some ways already too late. Elegy is most explicitly suited to this temporality of belatedness, as the genre of poetry where lateness is the explicit occasion for reflection. Grimet's poem cycle, Elegy, takes grief as its main temporality and route back to the Mediterranean. It's an attempt to rethink the capacity of contemporary poetry to arrange grief over ongoing deaths through the form of elegy, and to address Black diasporic futurity by addressing the dead. And she addresses the dead directly, the speaker, in these poems. In doing so, the poetry moves between three competing modes for thinking about the racial and geopolitical forms of contemporary migration around the sea. The poetry of mourning and theories of Blackness in the afterlife of slavery, and a critique of imperial and state and international practices at borders. Here it's helpful to remember Yolita Goyal, a recent visitor to the series, in her recent argument that U.S.-centered theories of diaspora risk minimizing the many histories and geographies of African diasporas. Moving instead between these registers, instead of only looking at committing to one, as I think Shure and Germain do, they move between these registers. Ask that we think about the multiple and varied new diasporas that are not reducible or rigidly analogous to the African diaspora of the transatlantic legal slave system. So, Germain's The Black Maria is the book, and it contains two poem cycles, Elegy and the title cycle, The Black Maria. Elegy marks the 2013 October drowning of an estimated 300 people, nearly all Eritrean, off the coast of the Italian island that we now heard a lot about, Lampedusa. Germain notes that, quote, elegy means to place itself in both the English elegiac tradition and the eulogatory traditions of grieving and joy in cultures of North and East Africa, merging the individual poet's writing and the collective's embodiment in sounds of intense affect outside of language. If you've heard of ululation, or if you can do it yourself, you can get it. As the poetry of mourning, elegy responds both to its own poetic tradition and to contemporary social forms for experiencing loss and grief. As a mimesis of mourning, elegy arranges grief as this imaginative return to the time and space of loss, the turn back. And elegy stages grief as a mode of return tied to an assemblage of poetic forms and themes of return. Together, they invoke mourning and hold on to it as indefinite. It's like this formal return and return and return to different moments and different scenes in the Mediterranean. Even when the poem cycle follows the general elegiac pattern of lament and praise and solace, it retains a sense of uncompletable grief that transforms the speaker. Elegy follows this diminished distinction between mourning and melancholia that Judith Butler and Johann Ramazani and Arcliffe and Spargo have described in different ways. And I'll get to that in a second. The second cycle, the Black Maria, is named after black seas, or seas from the Latin mare, which commits to this incompleteness of mourning. So you have Elegy as the first major poem cycle, and then you have the Black Maria. And in arranging it this way, it constellates the Elegy poems, which are focused on Eritrean deaths in the Mediterranean, with U.S.-centered poems on black deaths, or else miraculous survivals on U.S. land. So where the first cycle addresses the sea and its insensibility to the deaths of people in it, the second reflects on the insensibility of humans who missee others' pain and misname their loss, cutting fresh lines of grief for others to feel. It shows that incompleteness is not only a melancholic resistance to fully accepting someone's death, but that incompleteness is the very structure of ongoing, politically constructed mass death. How can mourning be successful or complete when the dying is preventable but still in process? The return to loss shapes elegy in more ways. Its imagined return to a collective mourning tradition in the extra ella of elegy generates its own tensions with the individual elegist's grief. Its lament is patterned as a historical repetition of mourning the collective dead, in slavery, then empire, then civil war, then post-colonial state violence, then border and migration policies, all in one poem, all addressed to you, and the you being the Eritreans in the Mediterranean. And sorry, I'm going to read from the poem. On the radio, a man listens to a Tigrinya song repeat and repeat something that means more or less Eritreans as fishes, and yet again it's you on that ship, stuttering across the sea. You have placed it on the scale of the ocean, weighing life against life, and again you lose, are shimmering with the silver sorrow of 1,000 arrows, 1,000 nails. It is October 2013, off the coast of Lampedusa. The Italian fishermen, whose grandfathers nearly 100 years ago barred our grandfathers from our grandfathers' land. These grandfathers meet again through you, and the fishermen, who, some of them, pull you from the sea, who, some of them, watch you drown, out of ruin, out of hate, out of fear. A short rhyme cycle later in the cycle, returns us to this image to apostrophize the dead. This is another section. Dedicated Luam, who says to the dead, "See near Lampedusa. I saw the 100 fishes from a distance, and this is what I knew. They were not fishes, they were you." Most poems in Elegy are addressed to the dead or to the sea or both, as if they were one. And in Elegy, the Mediterranean is caught in the temporal hold of unfinished pasts and overdetermined futures. More than once, she names poems simply "To the Sea," Annie, joining the Mediterranean to a litany of others: the Red Sea, Caribbean, the Affluent Sea, Sea of Death, and other bodies of water, oceans, rivers, even the moon craters misnamed the Black Maria or Black Seas by astronomers who mistook shadow for dark water. Refusing the comfort of pathetic fallacy, Grimet returns repeatedly to the insensibility of the sea to the human world, even as the speaker addresses it. One of the poems is titled "To the Sea, Annie," and it ends this way: "Sea, blackness, are Eurydice? At the shoreline when we ask, where are our dead? Have you carried them back to us? You repeat only, who? Who?" The sea is insensible but speaks back. Its answer is itself a question that reveals the sea as one of forgetting. Not just insensible because it's water, but insensible because it seems not to remember or feel any grief for the dead it carries to the living, who can claim the dead but can't claim their bodies. In this moment, the sea confirms its otherworldliness, echoing the Eurydice of Rilke's 1907 poem, Orpheus Eurydice, Hermes. The poem retells the ancient Mediterranean story of Orpheus' desire to pull his dead beloved back with him into the world of the living, a poem of her near miraculous but ultimately failed return. I was hoping Sam Frederick would be here and that I would be able to show him the German that I don't know. And I bet others of you also know German. And that I don't know. So this is the translation by Stephen Mitchell. Oh yeah, I know.
No, she was holding in her ears. We go way back.
He's had the unfortunate experience of knowing me very well. Well, hopefully fortunate most of the time. And so, forgive me for reading to you still, but in the English. Would you read the German? Could you read the German?
Do you really want me to? I don't know if you want me to.
It's a cold read.
Sie war schon aufgelöst wie langes Haar und hingegeben wie gefallener Regen. I can barely read it. Und eingestellt wie 100-facher Vorrat. Sie war schon Wurzel. Und als plötzlich der Gott sie anhielt und mit Schmerz im Ausruf die Worte sprach, er hat sich umgewendet, begriff sie nichts und sagte leise, wer?
Okay, see the English. Like Eurydice, the sea has become taken by its own fullness of death. The sea is what Grimet calls the body of bodies. Rilke's poem describes this fullness earlier. The English is, deep within herself, being dead filled her beyond fulfillment. Like a fruit suffused with its own mystery and sweetness, she was filled with her vast death, which was so new she could not understand that it had happened. It's there. In the second part. It's the story of a failed return from the underworld, a story you know, the lost potential of recrossing the boundary between death and life. Orpheus' look back as they ascended from the underworld was an intervention too early, but his failure to achieve the near impossible underscores the grim truth that his intervention, the effort to keep Eurydice alive, to save her from death, had always already been too late. In the next section, in an essay on Randall Jarrell's 1940 poem, The Refugees, critic Art Lifton Spargo sees the poem's grief for the Jewish refugees who will be denied refuge as a proleptic elegy. He writes, "Split thus between the report of an impossible intervention, it is too late for these refugees, and the remaining possibility of a real political intervention in immigration policy, because it's not too late for others. The speaker's fatalism interrogates contemporary American anti-immigration policies, that were actively yielding refugees to suffering and death all across occupied Europe. And that's from Spargo. Spargo sees an ethical possibility in the uselessness of mourning. He sees an elegy to those who die by orchestrated violence as having a special potential to upset norms, in that it, quote, comments on a political division that casts some lives as more worthy than others. Elegy can become an act of futile dissent. Spargo's reading, I have some questions about it, but here I want to say that it highlights the limits nationalist and humanitarian frames can have on the proleptic elegy, when refugee suffering is recentered on subjects who can do the grieving, and then take as a given that refugee deaths are as natural as the weather. When the capacity to perform grief serves as the main coordinates for both elegy and refugee futures, a potentially deeply unethical poetic act akin to state leaders' pronouncements of these tragic events is possible, where the elegist mourns the dead but remains insufficiently moved by the precarity that ensures mass killings. Here the echoes of Black and anti-colonial theorists may be important to listen for, and thinking about the Holocaust rehearsals elsewhere, and the racist construction of the modern refugee as a category, and the limited imagination of when fascism starts and when it returns. This decentering and grappling with political injustice in poetic form can be a challenge for elegies. What can be the poet's relationship to the lost but the beginning of a relationship that has to work up the feeling of intimacy and grief despite levels of abstraction? To grieve publicly for the death of those you don't know, who wouldn't have been able lawfully to occupy the same space as you, who can't prompt the feeling of imagined community as fellow compatriots. The structures of feeling in diaspora may be, in this context, an important form of imagined return and reconnection. Critics of poetic and social forms for practicing grief have underscored in various ways the relationship between the genre of elegy and democracy, ethical responsibility, aggressive nationalism, breakdown of cultural norms for mourning. What is an elegy for those whose lives have been emptied of their own histories? How does incomplete mourning also represent the temporality of the ongoing refugee situation, where the elegy is not to mourn those particular lives, but also the continuation of orchestrated deaths? Gourmet, I think, stages these problems as a poetic and a political one. And there are moments when she tries to sort of decenter the elegist and even the dead and the sea, so that they are not the central figures of the poems, but the relatives of those who crossed, who didn't survive the crossing, instead sort of take over in these imagined moments that for time I won't describe here. But I want to say that elegy holds on to the tension between two cultural forms for sounding grief. It pushes against the elegiac tradition at some level, merging it with the obligatory tradition of collective grieving, where eloquent statements of the dead have no place, where instead the collective shares in grief that sounds like shouts broken and shaped only by moving the tongue against the roof of the mouth, insisting on hitting against the limits of the body to make a sound. Not only the refugee seekers, but the refugee crises too can be emptied of their history and the returns that they've made and that they may have made for others. The going back, the coming to, the exchange made, or the profit gained. How can we think again about the Eritrean and Sudanese refugees who ventured onto the Mediterranean Sea? Does it matter that for some it wasn't their first search for asylum? So this is my last section. In January 2018, a group of researchers released a report on Israel's voluntary departure program and its shift to a policy of forcible deportations for more than 37,000 people residing in Israel after irregularly crossing its southern border with Egypt. Legally defined as infiltrators, 71% are Eritrean and 21% are Sudanese nationals. Israeli courts have recognized the virtual impossibility of these asylum seekers or would-be asylum seekers to even apply for asylum. Structurally, Israel makes it very, very difficult. And the state's policy has been to make their lives miserable, is a quote from one official. Unable to repatriate the infiltrators to Eritrea or Sudan, Israel has improvised its own Back to Africa plan, sending these would-be asylum seekers to a third country, and it's reported to be Rwanda or Uganda, with promises of dignity, asylum work, good future, and $3,500 in cash. Survivors testify that in practice, they were promptly taken from airports upon arrival, kept against their will, robbed, beaten, incarcerated, and thrown into the dangerous smugglers' routes. So their new displacement begins, and if you can imagine where they were in Israel, they're flown to Rwanda or Uganda. They make it through Uganda. to South Sudan, to Sudan, up to Libya. They've already crossed the Saharan Desert, and then across the Mediterranean Sea to Europe, where if they survived, over 90% had received asylum. Survivors interviewed by these researchers lamented those who didn't survive, some having been like them voluntarily departed from Israel. And this is a quote from one of the survivors. In the Sahara, people died and we buried them. This is life, this life. I don't want to remember it. It's hard to think about this. At night it returns to our head, it returns. I don't want to remember. It goes on. You can get this report online. The survivor's testimony enters the dead into the record of this report as people that the survivors remember. People they literally were among who could have been survivors. It echoes the interviews Shireen turned into conversations about home at the deportation center, and that both aim to bear witness and intervene before it's too late again. What distinguishes a proleptic elegy from these survivors' testimonies, besides their temporal relation to anticipated or remembered death, and the forms that we're used to. How is the problem of lived memory and the voicing of grief shared and not shared between these refugee survivors and an elegist from the diaspora? How did both positions return us back to the problem of the elegy and its nationalism, the elegy in the midst of another refugee crisis? The Eritreans interviewed in the report left Israel in 2014 and 15 to make the same sea crossing as those on the vessel in October 2013 near Lampedusa, or in what the research agency Forensic Architecture, paired with Forensic Oceanography, calls the Left to Die boat, which in 2011 had nearly 70 people in distress, slowly drifting in what is said in the report as the most heavily surveilled section on the planet. Forensic Oceanography's mapping of the slow temporality of drift shows the vessel leaving the Libyan coast, becoming distressed, and then drifting back to Libya, where the few survivors were imprisoned. And survivors also described pro-Gaddafi forces as encouraging or even forcing them onto vessels and launching them towards Europe. Forensic Architecture calls this weaponizing the refugees. How can we think about contemporary poetry's response to these deaths in light of the circuitous paths of return made as people reached places of potential refuge and then were made to leave those places? And what does this Mediterranean return to the histories of forced migration have to do with elegy, as the returns made too late? The exploitation of black refugees in Israel and Libya is the spectacle of Mediterranean anti-blackness. I want to see, though, also, in a poetics of return, the potential to resist against what Sharp calls the singularity of anti-blackness. She uses the physics metaphor of the collapse of all matter into a single point before falling into a black hole. Recently, the UN had a deal with Israel, and then it said no to this deal hours after it was announced. And we can always talk about that later. But it could have spared and stopped this kind of ongoingness from happening. And so it's going to keep happening. Instead of a conclusion, so we have taken up a lot of time already, I just want to end with one more Mediterranean return that Gourmet makes, where the return splices the ancient into the contemporary, the lament into the hopeful utterance. In a poem she dedicates to African-American artist Romare Bearden and his collage, The Siren's Song, which is part of the Black Odysseus series, she pleads with Bearden to help her see the beauty and not only the destruction. At the center of a bright blue sky, Bearden's Black Odysseus is tied high to the mast of his own ship. The yellow ropes crisscross tightly. His body is stationed high on the mast, but looks as if it's falling, suspended only by those ropes. We know from Homer's Odyssey that Bearden's Black Odysseus series is about a return, ever so slowly and circuitously a return home, perhaps to leave again. Resisting the singularity of anti-blackness, overwhelmed by the return on loss that the sea and states have delivered on for so long, Gourmet asks the question that is also the poet's challenge in this poetry of mourning. Here, I'll just leave you with the line she has in the poem, which is a question: how not to assign all blackness near the sea a captivity. And thank you very much.
Good time for questions and discussion.
There's so so much that you can tell me and teach me and help me with. So I really am I'm grateful for whatever conversation follows. Or we can keep looking because it's an amazing collage.
Do you want to start? Yes.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much for this. It was very touching and very informative. And the question I have, I think latches on a bit on Spargo and you're mentioning of him. And I remember reading at one point that he's talking about mourning as a way of refusal of the rituals that exist in a way to, or as a means of protest and questioning the ethics that exist at one specific point, right? So I just wanted to invite you, I think, more than just question, to speak a bit more about mourning as an act of dissent and as an act of protest against, you know, the crisis that you talked about, or in general as a way of, you know, questioning also hope and the utterances of, you know, a possible future that might materialize or not in some ways.
Thank you. So I can just kind of spin a little bit, but I'd also love to hear your thoughts about this and everyone. So a lot of this reading is new to me, I have to say. And I think it's interesting. I first read his PMLA article that came out just after his book was published, and it focused on this poem, The Refugees. And it does what's so much, I think, of the discussion around mourning and refugee deaths in the humanitarian frame and ethical frame kind of does, which is the griever is always the kind of the center coordinate. And I'm not always sure when it's when grief there or mourner is a feeling or a ritual or a position. Does that make sense? Sometimes, I mean, it's given. So I find it promising and interesting to really think about, but there's also some kind of limit I'm hitting up against, and I'm not sure how to put it into words. At some point, Spargo says that elegy is the very basis, and literature can be the very basis for the ethical, because he's drawing from Levinas and the radical alterity of the other. And I don't have a conclusion to this, but I want to say that it always sits a little ill with me. this kind of this kind of, I don't know, Levinas's philosophy of ethics. There are some of you may know more and can say more and can teach me more. I don't know if I'm answering your question either, except to say that there's something important to be done here. And in the form of poetry, there is that space of reflection, and I like that. And as an act of dissent, a dissent that's useless, and a dissent that doesn't do more than say, my dissent amount is because I am grieving these deaths. Does that make sense? Is maybe where I'm finding my trouble. Like, I think it's the dissent must not only be that I'm human enough and wonderful enough to grieve these deaths and others don't. It's more like these are forms that are operating, like political forms that are operating in the world. So how do we change the aim of our dissent? Does that make sense? Thank you.
Sure.
Question kind of piggybacks off that, which maybe is just to ask you to think freely about, or to speculate about what you might find if dissent and complicity aren't kind of assumed to be paired terms, but if there's a bunch of gray area in between, and if in fact elegy is a tool, a literary tool that we use to explore some of that gray area. I don't know where you would go with that, but I also am troubled by notions that attempt to, in a whole other range of contexts push literary or artistic production into either complicity or dissent kind of binaries. And I think it's much more complicated than that. And there's a lot of useful, interesting, helpful stuff that happens in that messy middle.
Thank you. I'm with you. I guess I'm interested in how you're describing it, and that the dissent or complicity just doesn't. I don't know. It's not where the art and the response is activated in most interesting ways. I think for me, and somebody might. I saw a hand.
I guess I have another thought to throw into the mix of this conversation. Thanks for really this beautiful material and a really fascinating reading of it. I'm sort of fixating on what you brought up about affect and mourning, and particularly the way that affect is such an important kind of strategy of what the poem, one of them, you mentioned the relation of what it's doing. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you're quite
follow
right. In Elegy, in the domain
Elegy. And I'm thinking about, it's making me think about how we use affect to kind of identify a presence or absence of mourning, or even a presence or absence of something like dissent, and it's sort of different spectrums. And I'm wondering maybe if part of what is happening here is that the poetry and kind of literature as an intervention into the recognition of people who are grievable or refugees, of those sorts of things is intervening in those very metrics of how we use affect differently to identify if a politics of mourning, or if a person is mourning, or if and how actually those are not, we can't rely necessarily on those metrics of affect to understand what is going on. And so that's another, I don't know, thing to throw into the mix there.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. I think you're right. I mean, yeah, we will all be a
I just have
polyphony.
a specific question tying into what Charlotte and Victoria were saying. I'm very interested in complicity, so then I'm wondering, where does this poetry locate the reader? That's how I'm interested in novels that deal with complicity. Where is the reader? And then if you think about it in relationship to Orpheus and Eurydice, does it locate us as Orpheus? Do we sentence people to death by looking at them? I was wondering where your thoughts go on that. Where is the reader in this poetry?
Yeah, that's great. And in a simple way, I think that's returning me to Spargo and Randall Jarrell's Refugees poem, because so many of them, I just saw so many that were assuming the subject citizen that's mourning what the state is complicit in, or and then those who are lost are supposed to be the subject, but they're really the effects of the speaker's grief over the failure of his own, of his usually or her own state. And I think it's interesting for me. Chire's poems, there's the citizen listener who's also immigrant, and who's kind of it happens formally in the poem all the time, but it's always, I think, focused on the audience as a European audience. And you get that in the use of you. So the you is that form of address is like you, and you're like the one who's running, because nobody would run unless the conditions were there that makes anybody run. But with Gourmet, it's different. She still uses you. It's just that when she says you, the speaker's address is to the sea, or it's to the dead in the sea. And there are only small moments when, like in a poem, the speaker thinks about the meaninglessness of her ordinary life in the midst of so much that's happening, and feels overwhelmed by that moment of thought. But then it returns. And so what position is that you? Or who is supposed to be listening? Are we the sea? Are we the dead? It also is speaking to, like, you see a kind of Eritrean history and context that isn't just made for readers who don't know. And yet she's still a US-based poet. You know, these are UK and US-based poets that I'm talking about. So they're sort of in these centers, but they're trying to find a different relationship than one of the citizen who makes a humanitarian show of grief, even if it's sincerely felt, on behalf of others. That, like, that radical alterity of other as a category, I know it's not what living us means, but it's sometimes there in poems and discussions about refugee situations. And there, it's not. It's like there are different lines of affiliation. Does that help, or does that make sense? But I mean, Gourmet is already still concerned about the poet. Like, you see it in Orpheus, you know. This is the man to raise when you think about poetry and what it can do in song. So she's playing at these different levels.
Okay, I have a question.
Following up maybe a little bit on that, I was also struck by the way in which the transtemporality of the experience of mourning and refugees and so forth is framed in a European context. Odysseus, Orpheus, Elegy, Rilke, and many of your other points of reference. And it made me wonder also, who's the reader, who's the audience, what are the original languages of the poetry? And are there also layers of reference that I'm not going to recognize because I'm not familiar with them, that assert a similar transtemporality of the experience in Eritrean or other African traditions? Are there echoes there of myth, legend, cultural specificities, or is there instead an intentional projection of the image?
Yeah.
An intentional projection of this issue onto Western canonical poetic literary tradition. Elegy itself,
That's right.
as a form that originates in the ancient Mediterranean, but what we think of as Western world.
Yeah, partly that's a fantasy of the Western world that they can claim the Mediterranean as the best. But this is a great question. The short, some descriptions. So Gourmet is writing in English. Shirei is writing in English, for sure. And then there are moments I didn't get to talk about, but that can kind of be absent in discussions of this subject. That also feature in her poems. And one is the recent history in Eritrea. It's like sometimes, this is the other problem with the weird humanitarian frames we have, where it really doesn't matter what people are, like, what is the situation that people find themselves in? What histories are they leaving? Or what conditions in their countries are they leaving? When you talk to people, they don't usually, they have their own, like, mess of particularities. And then there's the relationship of individuals to the state. So in Gourmet, she's very attentive to the Eritrean history, especially in the last, I guess, 30 years, 20 years. For example, the compulsory state service, that's supposed to be 18 months long, but it's indefinite. And so it's not recognized. It can be denied by other states that there's a human rights violation going on. Because the state of Eritrea says we'll only keep people for 18 months. Or they'll move to, like, work on plantations that officers own. These are things that, just even teaching, escape some readers, but they're there. The cultural references in Return to the Mediterranean, I think, is actually trying to contend with the legacy, the situation of, keep using situation because the UN is the word and I keep using the word. It's so nicely vague. But the Mediterranean it's like so loaded as the achievement of this intercultural space and a Western, provenance, that there's something, I think, instead of just looking to other traditions, there's a kind of sense of how do we contend with the status and the amazing literary significance of this space? Does that make sense?
The name of it is Latin.
Yeah.
Because there are so
Yeah.
many points of reference.
Yes. And they exactly, I mean, even the Latin there, if you look at another Latin phrase, Mare Nostrum, it was Mussolini's project. He called it Mare Nostrum. It's the possession. This is our sea. It's not the Sea of North Africa. It's not the sea. And then it's the name for rescue missions in the Mediterranean, the refugees. And it was I think it was replaced by Frontex and a more militarized approach to minimize, to give the minimal assistance possible. Was like the official aim of the new operations. But a fascist plan, a claim of possession, earlier the Latin, that gets revitalized by Mussolini, and then a humanitarian mission, now in our time. You know, I guess it's like these layers. I think Gourmet does the most to kind of get at these changes. Does that help? Thank you.
Angela, I'm wondering if I could follow up, a follow-up to several of these questions based on actually something I misheard. And that's how I roll with misprision as productive. But when you're talking about dissent and complicity, I heard descent, thinking about the descent into the underworld and the status of the sea, the status of classical reference in the Western sense, and the status of these sort of possessions of sites and somewhat inchoate but significant geopolitical spaces and mediums, right, and forms. And so I'm wondering if there's a way in which the position addressed, the position from which and to which Elegy speaks is conceivable in terms of creating, not only working from different oceanic positions, right? So you have this idea that the history of diaspora and the history of refugees is being kind of shored up together. But also that the idea that speaking to the fullness of the sea, or as if we're from the fullness of the sea, is a way, in a sense, to unclaim, if not reclaim, but to unclaim through Elegy the very sphere of Elegy itself, the very sphere of the Mediterranean itself, to unclaim these forms that have been rooted to imperial possession. And what does it mean to be able to occupy, in a sense, Elegy and all that it refers to, and that temporality as a kind of, as a not yet, or as a no longer possessed and burdened form, right? Can you talk about sort of the idea that returns, all these sort of forms have been so overdetermined and they're burdened with this sort of sense of their political and historical use value somehow. Is there a way in which that might be the way that those positions are casting not a humanistic subject, but an appeal to the depth of the sea, the inhuman form of Elegy, and so forth, as a kind of space clearing?
I want to keep thinking about it. No, the opposite. I mean, I love the way you put it. I think that's so beautiful, that kind of unclaiming. I don't know if this is going to make any sense, but I'm going back to the question of affect and thinking about that unclaiming and that unburdening. But, so I don't share the same exact context of the Eritrean, diasporic poet, right? But I'm thinking about the question of eloquence. This is why I'm going to ask you if it makes any sense, because I'm sorry, I'm going to just tell you something about me growing up, and you can help me sort it out. But when I was a child, I never went to I'm in Michigan, but I never went to a American style, like the code of mourning, the funeral, the wake, and all of that until I was 18 or 19 years old. But before that, what people did was gather, and eloquence wasn't even a question. It's not part of the performance of grief and the feeling of grief. There was no eloquence. There was no convention of how you do this. There was only the keening. And Gourmet talks about ululation, and it's true, it can be the sound of grief. But in my context, it's usually the sound of joy. And so, I do this, we do this with my family all the time. And it's like there's no form. You can go on and on and on, short or long, but there's a simplicity to it. And it's like the anti-eloquence in my head. Does that make any sense? And so when I think about Gervais, she's a US poet. I think she's in the MFA scene, she's like part of all of these conventions and the references. She has to use them. You can just see that that's so deep. But can she, by taking them up, also unclaim them? Can she, by taking them up, actually change the structure by which we understand the space or the possibilities of elegy? Maybe I'm just asking in a less good way your question.
But I think
But it's something that, it's something I'm thinking about. Again, this feels pretty new to me, and at the same time, I feel like she is trying to do something there. Does that make sense? It doesn't.
It does. I'm just wanting to make sure if there are any other questions before.
Who's my next victim? Be careful what kind of answer I'm going to give you.
Because there's something, one has to be leery of just simply solving abstractly or conceptually something that is not solved by that, right?
Yeah.
And so it's the idea that there's a poetics at work in thinking about responding to conditions of geopolitical emergency, ongoing geopolitical emergency. Makes it kind of rude somehow, right? Makes it like a violent act just to say it's an unclaiming of this thing. I'm saying on my stammer here, why? But if the project is how to create a kind of subject position, I'm thinking about some of these questions, right? How to think about a position that is no longer the humanitarian, right? Which is clearly a position that has become so bound up in the complicity, where the position of mourning is the only way that you can, that it can work. Oh, we're so sad for the ones that have died. Okay, back to the pub, but rather, how does one create a position, a scenario, a worldview in which hospitality, right, is possible? To what does one appeal in the construction of a kind of affective, subjective worldview, right? So what does that look like? So that's the way that can be answered abstractly, but I think it's really sort of pressing question.
Yeah, and it's just to say that with the subject position, hospitality isn't only the frame.
Right.
So one thing I'm thinking about are these diasporic writers, but also refugee writers and refugee poets, refugee artists, who I guess, and this is why I'm starting at such an abstract in the general project, question about time and space, and you get only particulars here, but it's because how does this process actually get us to conceptualize and get us to conceptualize space and time, where refugee workers, people who are unauthorized, not only have refugee status, if you think capaciously about this term, and also the people who refuse to be categorized as refugees, all of these kind of irregular categories. I think there's something so much more complex, so much more interesting, and I'm just starting to get at what those are. And the biggest body of work maybe is those are the Palestinian writers, poets, comics writers. They have, because of this protraction of the thing that's supposed to be temporary, have a whole, obviously rich set of references. And here, I feel like it's thinner. Does that make sense? In responses and the questions of what is the subject position to occupy fictionally in a novel or a short story or a poem, and what is its effect? I feel like the weight of that humanitarian hosting, the would-be host is so strong. I guess it's just to say yes. And how do we think about that with human rights workers and NGO documents and all of this that helps to manage and actually continue these forms, you know? Is what I'm trying to do without making any direct. One doesn't explain the other or solve the other for sure. But kind of interested in seeing what happens there.
Well, we are now out of time, so Rachel?
Thank you very much for your wonderful